This is chapter 14, part 4, the growth of the Protestant Reformation. The main idea of this section of reading and notes is that the new Protestant faith did not stay just as Lutheranism. That was the first group to challenge the Catholic Church, led by Luther himself. But very quickly after Luther was successful, there's all these new different brands or types of the new Protestant faith. And it quickly spreads. There's always still just going to be one Catholic Church, but now we have Calvinism, we have Anabaptism, we have the Church of England, we have several new forms of Protestant faith. So it's very diverse. And all of them have their unique characteristics that separate them from the others. Okay? So the first thing you should do is take a look at this map, which is actually very similar to the map in your textbook. The map is 14.2 in your textbook on page 478, and this is almost identical. You got to know where the new branches of Christian faith spread. You can look at this and see that most of Europe remains very, very Catholic. There are little pockets of new Protestant believers throughout Europe. The Lutherans end up mainly in Northern Europe. Wittenberg, that's where Luther was the professor of theology at the university, and way up into Scandinavia. So we'll talk about that later. That's where Lutheranism as a stronghold really takes hold. There's this other faith called Calvinism. That's mainly in Switzerland and the Netherlands and Scotland. And then there's the Anglican Church we'll get to today. That's the Church of England, as you can see, just England and a little bit of Ireland. And then there's these people called Huguenots. These are mainly in France. These are French Calvinists, and they take the name Huguenots, and we'll hear more about them actually in the next chapter. So let's get right into the first one. Calvinism, led by a French-born minister named John Calvin. He was born in France but lived and worked, and mainly his impact is in modern-day Switzerland. So Calvinism is, just to give you some overview here, is very strict. It's very emphasizes moral teaching and being a very moral person. And so one of the main characteristics of this group is that they established a theocracy in the city of Geneva, Switzerland. And so they believe that the government and the church should be the same. That's what theocracy means. And so Geneva was known as the city that was a church. So they believed in being very involved and integrated into the government of their community. So the government of Geneva was actually run by ministers at the time. So this is right in the aftermath of Luther in Germany. John Calvin does something similar in Switzerland, except he takes over the government, unlike Luther, who actually supports the existing princes. All right, so what's the main idea of Calvinism? And you can tell by even the picture of John Calvin himself, the seriousness of it. It's about moral seriousness. They believe primarily in this concept that God is totally sovereign, means powerful, omnipotent, and people are totally sinful and totally weak and in need of God's forgiveness. Calvinists do not really believe that there is free will in terms of your religious faith. Instead, they believe in a concept known as predestination, which is that God already knows and already has chosen those who will be saved and go to heaven and those who will not. And that is because he is God and he has foreknowledge. He knows before time who's who and who's what, and he's decided by his decree, his own terrible decree, some people say, the saved and the damned, and there's nothing you can do about it. And those who are chosen are known as the elect, E-L-E-C-T, and of course the Calvinists believe that they are the elect. This is a complicated concept. It's really difficult. I'll try to explain it a bit more in class. You'd think that if you believed that, then if you were one of the chosen, then what good is there to do good or to be nice or to even behave? If you're picked, you're in. So wouldn't this give people an excuse to do whatever they want? But the Calvinists said, nope, this is just, they are super motivated by this belief to work hard and be very moral and very serious about their faith. And they are the chosen, and so they are God's special people, and so they're incredibly motivated people. Always remember that about the Calvinists. They're not just sitting around waiting to go to heaven. They're incredibly hardworking people. And here's some cartoons that sort of, trying to make light of the concept of predestination. But again, I'll try to teach you a little bit more about that in class, but you've got the basics for now. So, moral seriousness of Calvinism. They believe in preaching. If you go to a Calvinist church service, lots of preaching, sometimes hours long, a sermon by a minister. The people had to memorize scripture. They had to memorize. They participated in the church service. The minister would question and they'd have Q&A. He'd ask a series of questions, and you would have to know the answers memorized. So it's very kind of serious stuff. People sat on hard wooden benches in a Calvinist church, separate, the men on one side, the women on the other, so you can see the kind of gender relations that they had. Don't sit next to women. You know what that leads to. No art. A Calvinist church would have no art in it. Nothing distracting you from the pure message of the Bible. And this is all day kind of stuff. Now, these guys, like I said, were integrated into the government of Switzerland. So they had what's called the Genevan Consistory, which was a group of ministers that policed the morality of the citizens. And this was like a court system, like a tribunal. And your name could, if you did, committed some sins, your name might come in front of this council of ministers, the consistory, and they could issue punishments. In terms of your bad behavior. They could banish you if need be. They could burn you at the stake if you were bad enough. And that happened to this one guy, a very famous example of a dissident, someone that sort of didn't fit the mold. His name was Michael Servetus, and he questioned the belief in the Trinity, which is Father and Son and Holy Spirit, and he just wouldn't quite go along with the Calvinist teaching in Geneva. And they had this guy burned at the stake. His whole story is in the textbook. You ought to read it. All right, what is the impact of Calvinism? It's actually really important. These guys spread, they're dynamic, they go all over the world. They become known as Presbyterians up in Scotland. They become known as the Huguenots in France, as I mentioned. They become known as the Puritans in England and later in North America. So our own American heritage really goes back strongly to the Calvinists here. Their teaching on women was fairly traditional. They believed that women should be married and domestic. But they went on and say women can't just sit around their houses all day. They have to be active in their community. They have to do charity work and really help the poor. These are some things that distinguish the teaching on women maybe from some of the other Christian faiths. And then all of this culminates in what we would call the Protestant or the Calvinist work ethic. Remember, they're dynamic and vigorous people. They believe that work is a call from God, a calling. What you do for a living is from God, and so you better do it right. You better work hard. Hard work is pleasing to God. Doing your work not for men, but for God. So that concept of the work ethic is really powerful. It sort of helps shape American life down the road. When you think of capitalism and the American dream, if you just work hard enough, anyone can become anything. So there's a big Calvinist Puritan heritage here in America. Those folks actually founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. One of our first colonies in North America from the English settlers was a group of Puritans. They were on the Mayflower. The Puritans were on the Mayflower. That's who they were, and they founded Boston. And so all that New England heritage of our country and a lot of the revolutionary leaders like John Adams and all these guys down the road have that background of this really seriousness, work ethic, and even fight for what you believe in. All right, let's go to the next group. You couldn't be more opposite. The Anabaptists are peace-loving, wonderful, soft-hearted people who have very different pacifist views from the Calvinists. So the core beliefs of the Anabaptists, this little sect, say we need to baptize or rebaptize adults only. We do not want to baptize babies or kids or infants. We need to wait for people to be adults and let them make their own decision about their faith. These guys you can see how different they are from the other groups. Very modern. Babies have no idea what's going on. Let's wait for them to grow up, and they can choose to be a part of this or not. And people who feel an inner light or experience the presence of God in their own heart, that's what we're going for, an inner personal experience. Nothing forced, nothing top-down, nothing like that at all. In fact, we believe in religious tolerance as an Anabaptist, but we're really big on that. If you don't like what we think, that's fine. We won't harm you. Live and let live. They let women be ministers in the Anabaptist tradition. The only people to do that by any means. They believed in pacifism, which is anti-war. They wouldn't fight. They wouldn't take up arms. They wouldn't participate in any of these major wars of that century. So no one was a pacifist at this time. Luther certainly wasn't a pacifist, but the Anabaptists are. They believed in separation of church and state when no one else did. This is the one that got him into most trouble, by the way. Put a little star by it as well, because when you think about living near the Calvinists, who are the government, and the Lutherans, who support the princes and their local government, these guys say we ought to have all this stuff separate completely. This sounds very American, doesn't it? And they refuse to hold public offices. So these guys were just certainly on the fringe. They were, not popular. They did not draw a lot of followers. The ones that came to the Anabaptist faith were usually poor people, unemployed, uneducated, almost like refugees. They were not drawn from the rich. Now, I forgot to mention up on Calvinism, write this down, that the Calvinists attracted the rich through that work ethic. So there's lots of wealthy Calvinists, and Switzerland is a rich place too. But the Anabaptists are usually poor and destitute, and so they're easy targets. These guys got bitterly persecuted by everybody else in Europe. Lutherans hated them, Catholics hated them, Calvinists hated them. They were killed in mass numbers, almost with a fanatical hatred. They were drowned. They were taken out onto boats, and they sunk the boats with a bunch of Anabaptists in them. These people were so freaked out by these guys. They were so different that they were just horribly persecuted. A really terrible story here. The legacy of the Anabaptists really lives on. Quakers in America today, Baptists, people that believe in the Baptist faith, where you don't baptize little kids, you wait for adults. Another group called the Congregationalists. Of course, Quakers are known for being pacifists and sitting in silence for long periods of time and being like that. And I think you need to find the evidence and the legacy of the Anabaptists in our own government, in our own Constitution. And you can see some of those characteristics are very much part of America today. So the thing about America is that we've sort of taken the best elements of each of these religious faiths, and they've been integrated into our society, and usually for the better. All right, let's get into the English story of England. Henry VIII is the King of England. And the main idea here is that Henry VIII uses religion to serve his political and personal ends. And it's not about religion. It's about his need for an heir and new wives and his political status and standing. That's what makes him break away from the Catholic Church and start a new church with himself as the leader. So it's not really anything about religion, although it becomes that. It's about this guy's personal and political needs. There had been earlier reforms in England long before Henry VIII, who's a Tudor, by the way. He's a Tudor, the second generation Tudor out of three, and then they go away. The Lollards, remember them from earlier in the chapter 12, were led by John Wycliffe, who said we ought to read the Bible in our own language and preach, and we didn't really need priests to intervene for us. And then William Tyndale helped actually translate the Bible into English, so he was a part of that movement. Basically, at the time of Henry VIII in England, the Catholic Church was incredibly strong in England, and nobody wanted to break away. There wasn't really a Luther-type figure up in England, so most English people are completely devoted to the Catholic faith, and they had no interest in changing it. This is top-down. The king changed the religion for everybody, whether they liked it or not. So it's very heavy-handed stuff. So it all starts with Henry VIII and his personal life. He was married to a woman named Catherine of Aragon, who is actually in the family of Ferdinand and Isabella. This is let me get this right here, either their daughter or granddaughter. Let me go flip my pages back and make sure I tell you the right information here. Catherine of Aragon is the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. And so she's super Catholic. Of course, but they were unable to have a child together. Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, they had girls, okay, but not boys. And you need a boy to be an heir, to be the future king of England. Plus, he fell in love with another woman, Henry VIII. He had his eyes on another woman the whole time. Anyway, he was not a faithful man. Here's what makes it complicated, though. Henry VIII Catherine of Aragon had previously been married, before she was married to Henry's older brother, who was actually meant to be the real king of England, but he died. And in a weird thing, Henry VIII, inherited the throne and his brother's wife, his dead brother's wife, who's Catherine of Aragon. And now they get married, so that's kind of creepy and weird. And in order to marry his dead brother's wife, Henry VIII had to go to the Pope and get special permission, because this is weird then and it's weird now. And they said, okay, you can have special permission to marry your dead brother's former wife. But that'll all come back in a minute. Anne Boleyn is who he likes now. He's fallen in love with this much younger woman named Anne Boleyn, and he wants to marry her and get rid of Catherine of Aragon. So he wants a divorce, in other words. He wants an annulment, is the correct word. Annulment means you go back and you get the marriage declared that it was never even real, and it wasn't a legal marriage. So Henry VIII went to the Pope at the time, and the Pope was a Medici Pope, and his name was Clement. And he was one of these Medici descendants in their family. And he goes, let me get out of my marriage with Catherine of Aragon and let me marry Anne Boleyn. And the Pope said, no, you can't do that. Because if we say you can do this, if we give you the annulment, it would actually admit that the previous Pope, who let Henry get married in the first place to his dead brother's wife, it would show that Pope was wrong. And we are not in the business right now of admitting errors, because we've got Martin Luther on the scene in Germany calling us on all of our problems. And the Pope had to save face here. So he wouldn't go back and grant the annulment, because it would give Luther more ammunition to show that the popes are wrong about everything and they contradict each other all the time and they're unethical and immoral, which they sort of were. But this Pope says, I'm not giving Henry VIII this annulment to save our own face here, all right? So Henry VIII says, I don't need the consent of the Roman Catholic Church or the Pope. He knew about Luther already. Everyone's challenging the church. Henry VIII just simply breaks away from the church, declares himself the new head of the Church of England. A new church, new head, all about his personal life so he can marry Anne Boleyn. This is accomplished legally in England by Henry VIII getting the consent of Parliament. He went to Parliament and said, look, we need to do this for the good of England. And he twisted arms and threatened people. And, it was a real mess. A lot of the people in Parliament wouldn't go along with it. They refused, but he got a majority to say yes. And the Parliament passes what's called the Supremacy Act in 1534, which makes the king the head of the Church of England. New church, new king, new head. And some people said, this is ridiculous. There's prominent, famous dissenters that won't go along with this act of aggression by big Henry VIII here. Two famous guys, the most important, John Fisher and really Thomas More. That's the same guy that wrote Utopia, same guy that was the Lord Chancellor of England. Henry VIII's right-hand man, his attorney general, this guy was a loyal Catholic. He said, this is crazy. He called him on his blood, on his sin here of doing all this for personal reasons, and Henry VIII turned his friends over and had them executed. These guys were beheaded for treason. High-level government officials who said, we will not go along with this, this ludicrous behavior of our king, and they were put to death. So this stuff went to the highest levels. Henry VIII then married Anne Boleyn. So first Catherine of Aragon, who was divorced, then Anne Boleyn. He goes on to have 6 different wives. He's so famous for these 6 wives. It's almost like a play. There have been so many movies and songs written about these, because Henry VIII was just an unfaithful man, and he had some problem with every one of these women. So divorced, and then Anne Boleyn, they didn't have any kids with Anne Boleyn either. Couldn't have a son there. We got to get rid of her. To behead her. Divorced. Beheaded. Now Jane Seymour just died on him in childbirth. That's the third wife. She was giving birth to his only son, the third wife, and she died in childbirth, and that's the end of her. So divorced, beheaded, and died, and then we got to marry again. Divorced, Anne of Cleves, beheaded. Catherine Howard, didn't like her either, thought he was cheating on her. And then lastly, this is his last wife, Catherine Parr, who actually survived him. So divorced, beheaded, and died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. the 6 wives of Henry VIII. All right, what else does he do as king? He takes over the monasteries from the Catholic Church in England. He confiscated them for money and land, and then he sold them all off to the nobility in England. All that precious land and all the monasteries and farmlands of the church, he sold it. He ended monastic life in England. All of this heritage of learning and the Catholic Church, all was ended. In fact, the most famous piece of property that he confiscated was an old monastery in central London. Took it, demolished it, sold off all the land, and that land eventually becomes known as Hyde Park, which is the biggest public park in London. It used to be Catholic Church land, and now it's like a Central Park type place for the people of England. So he really has a huge impact here on the land, and this enriches the upper classes and himself. He gets rich from all the sale of this church land. There were lots of people that opposed this beyond Thomas More and John Fisher. There was massive groups of peasants and middle class people. They all got together in 1536 on what was called the Pilgrimage of Grace, and these are big protests across England that said, "Stop this! We're Catholics. We're loyal Catholics." It was a multi-social class rebellion, and of course, this is not going to be tolerated. Henry VIII had the leaders of the Pilgrimage of Grace arrested, tried, and executed for treason. So, just so you always know, the people of England did not go along with this peacefully. They, begged, pleaded, protested for this to stop, and they were suppressed brutally. The new Church of England actually looks a lot like the Catholic Church, and they retained many Catholic practices and doctrines. Doctrines are religious beliefs and truths. The only real difference is that now the church is run by Henry VIII and his staff, his growing bureaucracy of officials. But practically, the Church of England, the ceremonies, the rituals, all of that is pretty much still Catholic. This is why it really irritated people so much, because they said, look, this is the same as the Catholic faith, which is you've put yourself at the top, so we have a problem with that. All right, Henry VIII died in 1547, and he's got lots of kids now from all these different wives, and his only son is named Edward VI, who actually was a little boy when his father died, and he's only king of England for about 6 years, and then he died as a little boy, as a young man, of disease, and he doesn't make it into adulthood, so all that trouble to get a son, and the kid dies. And so, but Edward VI is a good little Protestant boy, like his father was, and the Protestants gained some ground here. And under Edward VI's reign, there's the Book of Common Prayer published, which is a standardized manual of how to conduct a church service in the Church of England. So no matter where you are in the country, the rituals and the ceremonies are going to be the same. Literally the same words are going to be spoken by the minister at each church service, but it's a Protestant version of it. It's run by the new Church of England. Okay, then he dies, sickness, and his sister, older sister, takes the throne. And she was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, who was Spanish and super Catholic. And so Bloody Mary Tudor was never meant to be queen, but now she was sort of unexpectedly queen. And she is a Catholic, so she reverses everything for 5 years, and England goes back to being Catholic. It didn't help that she was married to the King of Spain at this time, Philip II, who's the most Catholic dude you're going to find in Europe at this point. We're going to learn more about him in the next chapter, Philip II. So that these two guys together are super-duper Catholics, and they attack Protestants, and they burn them at the stake and persecute them and kill them for 5 years, and then she's dead and out. And then we switch course again to Queen Elizabeth I. This is all Henry VIII's kids. This was his daughter with Anne Boleyn, his Queen Elizabeth I. And so now she was raised as a Protestant, and she's going to take a middle course. That's the key about Elizabeth I. She's a good Machiavellian monarch that knows how to get power and keep people happy. So she's got all these extremists, the Catholics that were fans of her sister, Bloody Mary, and now there's Puritans up in England. Those are Calvinists have moved up into England by this point, and they want really extreme things on the other side. She's running a country of extremes here. Puritans want the church purified. That's what their name means. We want purity in our church. And the Church of England is corrupt, and it was led by a corrupt king, Henry VIII. So no one's really happy in England. So here's what Elizabeth does. The middle course, known as the Elizabethan settlement. She says, you have to have public conformity. Everyone in this country has to publicly profess that they're a member of the Church of England, and we leave it at that. Now, privately, you can do what you want. We're not going to investigate and punish your private religious beliefs of conscience as long as they're done behind closed doors, but publicly you have to swear to be a loyal member of the Church of England. This was good enough for most people in England. It wasn't good enough for the Puritans. They got out of England and went over to the Netherlands, Holland, where they hung out there for several decades until they got on that Mayflower and hightailed it over the Atlantic Ocean to America, where they could start a new society and be free of all these political influences. There's Queen Elizabeth. Also known as the Virgin Queen. She never got married, never had an heir, and she's the last of the Tudors. And after she's dead, they go away. We're going to learn more about Queen Elizabeth in the next chapter when she actually gets involved in the international political scene in the rest of Europe as the Reformation turns into war. All right, quickly finishing up here. Up in Scotland, a queen there is named Mary, Queen of Scots, and she is a super Catholic and is siding, of course, with the Pope on all this, like most people in Europe. And we're going to learn about her more later in the next chapter about why she actually got executed and killed as the Queen of Scotland. But if you want to look at that now, go ahead and look her up online and read her story. She's an interesting lady. So Scotland is a Catholic stronghold, but the Reformation spreads up there through a man named John Knox, and he brings Calvinism up there. Calvinism. And they are big on preaching, you know that, and standardized Calvinist preaching full of memorized, sermons, and that's what they do up in just like in Switzerland, they're going to do it in Scotland. Serious. He actually looks just like John Calvin, actually, with that same pointy face and pointy beard. And so, but up in Scotland, they take a new name. Instead of calling themselves Calvinists, they call themselves the Presbyterians. And it's governed and it's run by the ministers, the church. So just like in Geneva, how the city was run by ministers, it's not quite the same in Scotland, but the ministers run the church. So the presbytery the word literally translates into ministers, and they govern the church. Not the Pope, not the King of England, not the Mary Queen of Scots. The ministers run the church. This is big in Calvinism. Ministers are in charge. All right. Lastly, Ireland. The Reformation spread to Ireland by force. The English and the Irish have a long and brutal history. The English rule Ireland at this point. They rule it brutally with an iron fist. Irish are seen as almost like backwoods people, and they're totally, disrespected by the English in most of history. Irish, of course, at this point are Catholic like everyone else in Europe, but the English come in and try to force the Church of England on the people of Ireland, and the people of Ireland reject it, won't go along with it primarily. Only a little bit of Northern Ireland actually supports this new Church of England, but most Irish hold to the Catholic faith as part of their identity. If you know any Irish people today, they're always Irish Catholic. Like the Kennedys and these big families in history are Catholic, and they refuse to convert because they hate the English and they don't want anything that the English are doing. So this becomes a source of pride and nationalism for the people of Ireland. We're Catholic, don't force your religion on us. And it just makes English and Irish relations worse. And there's going to be a growing independence movement that starts in Ireland at this point that doesn't really find fulfillment until 1920. Ireland is not going to be a free nation separate from England until the 20th century, and now religion is something else that they fight about. Last section, G, Lutheranism up in Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. This is where Lutheranism becomes the strongest anywhere in the world. The kings of Scandinavia, the monarchs, take the lead in establishing state churches. So just like everywhere else, Lutherans support existing political authorities and the powers that be, And these kings like that, and so they break away from the Catholic faith as well, but they now, much like Henry VIII, make themselves the head of churches. So there's a Swedish church run by the Swedish king, and the same in Denmark and Norway. That's the distinguishing feature up in Scandinavia. Just know that it's a Lutheran stronghold, and it still is today. In fact, most people of this heritage are still staunchly Lutheran. Next time we'll do the notes, we'll talk about how the Catholics respond to all this. It's known as the Catholic Counter-Reformation. That's next time.